One of the most interesting people in the New Testament among the disciples of Jesus was the Apostle John. And tonight I want to talk with you a little bit about John, not as identified as John, but as identified as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, there's an interesting thing about this, because the Bible nowhere identifies the disciple whom Jesus loved as John. This identity came from a fellow who lived in the 2nd century, and it was just a supposition on his part, but the Bible doesn't identify him as John. Generally, we think of him as John, but there have been a number of other people who have been suggested as a disciple whom Jesus loved. One of those is Lazarus, because Jesus, when he went to the tomb of Lazarus, he was summoned with these words, "The one that you love is sick." And that turned out to be Lazarus, and so some people have supposed that maybe the disciple whom Jesus loved was really Lazarus. Various other people have been suggested, and even one woman was suggested as possibly Mary Magdalene as a disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, maybe I'm just very tradition bound, I'm not sure, but I always look at this as John. John was an interesting individual. He was probably the youngest of the 12 apostles. We don't know that for sure, but it is generally supposed that John was the youngest, mainly because John lived until in the AD 90s, about AD 95, the time that he wrote the book of Revelation. So John was probably the youngest of the disciples. Some people have thought that John might have been only about 18 years old when Jesus called him. We don't know that, of course, but we do know that he was the last of the apostles to die. John followed Jesus very early on. When we get the lists and so forth of the disciples in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and by the way, the Gospel of John doesn't tell us anything about a list of the 12 apostles, but John is always mentioned in them. There were 3 people that seem to have been very close to Jesus: Peter, James, and John. John was the son of Zebedee, and James and John were brothers. They were called the sons of thunder by Luke. You don't think of the disciple whom Jesus loved as being called the son of thunder. We don't know very much about why these two would have been called the sons of thunder. There was an interesting thing that took place a couple of times. The mother of James and John came and spoke to Jesus and said, "I have a request for you." "What is it?" "It is that my 2 sons may sit one on the right and one on the left when you come into your kingdom." And you know the answer that Jesus gave was that the one who is greatest is the servant of all. John doesn't mention himself. The Apostle John does not call his own name in the entire book of John. This may be one reason that people have supposed that it was John who was the disciple whom Jesus loved, because he doesn't call any attention to himself at all. Now, Matthew was the only other apostle who wrote one of the Gospels, and of course he wrote the Gospel according to Matthew. He does refer to himself in that Gospel. He was a tax collector, and in his Gospel he talks about Levi, who was Matthew, the other name for Matthew, sitting at the place of toll, or where the tax collector would have sat. John doesn't call his own name, though, in his Gospel. Of course, Mark was not an apostle, and Luke was not an apostle, and so you wouldn't expect them to mention their names there. But what about this apostle whom Jesus loved? Maybe one reason that Jesus loved this apostle is because when John wrote the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, when this apostle wrote these 3 books, more is said in those books about the love of Christ than any other books in the entire New Testament. And the statement in 1 John, where he talks about God is love and so forth, that's the second longest dissertation that we have in the New Testament on the subject of love. The other one is in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Now, what kind of person was John? Well, from what we gather in the writings of the Gospels and what we gather from the things that John himself wrote in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, number one, it does seem that he was a man who placed a great deal of emphasis on love. He also was a man who placed a great deal of emphasis on faith. It was John who wrote more about, in his gospel, who wrote more about the idea that you must believe than any of the other gospel writers. John, I won't say he was not interested in miracles, but John doesn't record but 7 miracles of Christ, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke record more than double that number. So John was interested in something, though. What was he interested in? He was interested in faith. Faith and love for John were two very, very important things. In the book of John, the gospel, he says more about you must believe than in any of the other gospel accounts of Jesus' ministry. Now, what did he mean by believe? In almost every circumstance, when John was talking about believing, it almost always has to do with, do you accept the claims of Christ? Sometimes this was backed up with a miracle. About 7 times a miracle of one sort or another is mentioned. But here, even here, John is very peculiar in the way he writes. Because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when a miracle was performed, it would just be mentioned. It was a miracle, and it would describe the miracle, and then he goes on to something else, maybe another miracle. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke deal with the miracles in and of themselves. John deals with the miracles in a different way. And maybe this gives us some idea of exactly what kind of character this man John was. I think that in John we have the combination of 2 very important things in inspiration, and that is that we see the character of the person who wrote. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John particularly give us that. But the second thing is we see the work of the Holy Spirit in inspiration. So here in John's writings, we see this very, very vividly because we see the personality of this man coming out in a great many of these situations. Now, when John wrote then about faith, John consistently was talking about and he had Jesus speaking about, that's really what I should have said. He had Jesus speaking about, you must believe that I am the one. The woman at the well, she said to Jesus, we know that the Messiah comes. And Jesus said, the one who is speaking to you, I am the Messiah. Jesus didn't make that claim overtly very many times anywhere except in the book of John. But there's a propositional idea here that John is very interested in, and that is that you must believe that Jesus is who he said he was. Now, it's interesting also that it was not in the book of John that Jesus claimed to be God's Son. Instead, Jesus is never challenged and never answered a challenge, I should say, never answered a challenge about, are you the Son of God? But when he was on trial, and not contained in John, by the way, this is part of the trial, when he was on trial, he was asked, are you the Son of the Blessed? Well, why didn't they say, are you the Son of God? Because the Jews had no concept of the idea of Trinity, and they were very cautious in the way that they used the name of God. And so they would sometimes refer to him as the Blessed One, rather than referring to him directly as God. And so they asked, are you the Son of the Blessed One? And the answer was, you said it. You said it. That's it. That's what it is. Now, this is not recorded in the book of John, and so it's kind of interesting that John defends the messiahship of Jesus very strongly, but at the same time, John is not the one, his gospel is not the one in which these things are mentioned that I just called attention to. The disciple whom Jesus loved. I want you to turn in the Bible for just a moment now to the book of 1 John, way over there toward the back of the book, toward the back of the Bible. I want you to turn, excuse me, I want you to turn, please, to chapter 4. I think in chapter 4 here, we have just a very important statement that John gives us about the whole idea of love. We're going to begin with the 7th verse, and we're going to read this. And I want you to see, I did not count these, but I want you to see how many times the idea of love comes up in this brief statement that John makes, beginning with verse 7 of chapter 4. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. And by the way, I might mention that John, in this particular place, is the only place that the expression God is love occurs in the New Testament. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sin. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete or perfect in us. We know that we live in him and he lives in us because he has given us his Spirit. And we have seen and testify that the Father has sent the Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in him and he in God. And so we know and rely on the love that God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in him. In this way, love is made complete among us so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment, because in this world we are like him. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment, and the one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. Anyone who says, I love God, and yet he hates his brother, he's a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And he has given us this commandment: whoever loves God must also love his brother. Like I said, I didn't count the number of times that the word love appears here, but see, Paul gives us a very different description of love. John seems to give us the idea of love because he has experienced the love of Christ in the person of Christ. I don't mean by that Paul had not experienced the love of God and the love of Christ, but Paul was not a follower of Jesus during Jesus' lifetime. John was. And so it seems that this puts the whole idea of love into a much more personal category than the way Paul deals with it. Paul deals with it rather generically. Love is kind, love is patient, love is not rude and things like this. And John gets down to it and talks about how we are to love one another. So John was probably the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was also the disciple of faith. When we read the book of John, as I mentioned a moment ago, when we read the book of John, we constantly run into this idea of you must believe. I think in this passage that I read just now for you, we see how John combines these two, particularly at the beginning with the 13th verse through the 18th verse. We see something about how faith and love combine to make the whole. And so he says, if you say that you believe but you don't have love, then your belief doesn't amount to anything. And so John, in a very unique and original way, combines these two ideas, faith and love. Another thing about John was that John was, when Jesus was arrested and so forth, it mentioned that the disciples were scattered. They ran away. John apparently did not, because John goes into, with Peter, John goes into the place there of the high priest where Jesus was going to be on trial before the high priest. And you remember John knew the high priest and he got entrance into the place because of that. And then Peter follows, and that's where Peter denied Christ, you know. But John was there, and Peter was there also. Later, when Christ was crucified, John was at the crucifixion. Isn't it interesting that the 12 are not mentioned as being present at the crucifixion? Their names are not given. But now, the disciple whom Jesus loved, Jesus spoke to him while Jesus was on the cross. What was one of the things that he said? Well, this is a sort of a strange thing. Mary had other children who are named in the book of Matthew and also in the book of Mark. But Jesus, when he died, or just before he died, Jesus gave John charge of his mother. And he says, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." And then a little statement is made there that from that point forward, this disciple cared for Mary, the mother of Christ. At some time, and we don't really know exactly when, but at some time after the crucifixion and after the scattering of the various disciples from Jerusalem after the church began, at some time between that time and the time of writing the book of John, John moved, according to tradition, John moved to the city of Ephesus. And it was in Ephesus that he stayed for many years. Then he was banished to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation, and then he returned to Ephesus, where he died. There's a legend, and that's all this is a legend, but it is kind of interesting that it would be preserved. But there is a legend that John, when he was very old, he was in his 90s, and we do know that he was a very old man when he died. He was in his 90s, and very feeble. And he came to the assembly. And they were so glad to see John. And they asked John, "John, do you have a word for the congregation?" And John, very feeble, got up. And all that he said was, "Love one another. Love one another." And he sat down. People are very strange. Some people went out and said, "What a magnificent thing for this old man to do, to remind us of the importance of loving one another." Some other people came out and said, "Well, he didn't have very much to say, did he?" But that's just kind of the way people are. They react differently. But the reason that I tell you of that legend is because whether it's true or not, that's not the point. The point is that the legacy that John left was a legacy of love. Everybody knew that John was a disciple of love. Whether or not he was the disciple whom Jesus loved is still an open question. We don't know very much about that. But we do know this, that John was a disciple who emphasized love. Now, that's just kind of a little short resume of the disciple whom Jesus loved. I was studying this. I tried to, I thought, how do I outline all of this? It's very hard to outline something like this. And so I just thought I would study and then just talk to you about this great man, rather than trying to have it as a sort of a formal sermon. When you read the book of John, or when you read 1st, 2nd, or 3rd John, stop and let him communicate with you, not just the words of what he says, but let him communicate the personality of this great man who is behind all of this. Stop and think of all of the things that he experienced. And this is what he came up with. His last words that we have in this little legend: love one another. And that's what he wrote in this 4th chapter. Love one another because love is of God. I think it's kind of easy for us to see that if indeed he was a disciple whom Jesus loved, we can understand why Jesus would have loved this man, because this man was a disciple of love. Let's stand together now while we sing, please.